Good day, everybody, and welcome to the Network of Education Policy Centre's Edu Focus webinar series, let's call it that. This is our second session in this format, and today we will be talking about another network that we are a member of, and we will present some of the research findings from the recent research that was done within the network. The network we will discuss today is the European Education Policy Network on Teacher and School Leaders. It's a Europe-wide network of different stakeholder organizations and individuals, both policymakers, practitioners, researchers. And the idea behind the EPN is that it will promote cooperation, policy development, and implementation at different governance levels in order to support the European Commission's work, policy work on teachers and school leaders. This project has been started, or the network, last year. We are now in the second year of the network. It is led by the European School Heads Association, and it involves 29 partners from 18 countries, so quite wide. Each year, the network decides the focus of its research. For this year, surprisingly, as this is also the main topic of the European Commission's work, is education in digital age. And in this perspective, from this network, it's about teachers and school leaders in digital age. In this focus, there were 5 papers prepared and have been just published about a few weeks ago. And the areas were digital technical tools, skills, and competencies that support teaching and learning, collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership in digitalization, the use of digital tools in teaching and learning, entrepreneurial skills and competencies, digitalization supporting literacy and multilingual competencies, and active skills and active citizenship skills in digital age. So 5 papers altogether. Of course, we will not discuss all 5 today. The topics for today will be presented by 2 researchers who worked on the papers. So Sandra Haugas from Praxis Centre for Policy Studies from Estonia. Sandra, welcome and thank you for joining us. And Peter Kemp from University of Plymouth in the UK. Sandra will talk about collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership, while Peter will focus on digital technical tools, skills, and competencies supporting teaching and learning. Welcome, Peter, as well. Welcome, Sandra. To start us off, I would like maybe Peter, as an overall, let's say, researcher in the network, or the one in charge of overlooking the research, to tell us a little bit about how this research is different to other research that is going on very, let's say, intensely on these topics in EU these days. Peter.
Yeah, sure. Well, if you've ever been involved in this area, you'll know that there is a huge amount of work going on across Europe, in fact, everywhere, in relation to digital tools, digital classrooms, digital citizenship, digital collaboration. A whole range of things is well researched. And you might then be asking, well, why on earth is a group like ours interested in doing something else? And it's really because we have, we represent a huge group of people, professional organizations. So we represent professional organizations right across the European Union, the European Community, which is in total 17 countries. And each of those has a organization within this consortium. And so what we did with this research was we started off with their expertise and their connections and their own networks. And we asked them to look at the material that was available within their countries. Most are national organizations. So we asked them to look at the material that was available in their countries, in their languages. And one of the things much research does is it tends to ignore research that isn't published in English, German, or French. It tends to just treat everything as being accessible and doesn't translate a range of research from different levels of governance written in the national language. It tends to miss that out. the beauty of our research was we were able to capture those things as well, because we asked member organisations in their own countries to look at things that were happening and to select for us some really inspiring examples of policy and practice in relation to the themes that we'd identified. So that was our starting point, was these examples of practice. And we got a huge, rich amount, and we got things that we otherwise would have missed because, you know, as a researcher based in the UK, there's no way I could have accessed it. And the same for other people within our core group. We couldn't have accessed a lot of this material. And in some ways, that's what makes our research original, because it's starting with the selection by professional organisations of inspiring examples of practice. And I don't think there's any other work out there that does that. We then looked at these inspiring examples, and in some areas there was a huge range of things. In other areas which are less well developed, there was perhaps a smaller amount of things. But every area had a good range of examples. We looked at these and we selected out some which we thought were representative of all of the examples that we had. And we identified common themes, we identified examples that were similar to things that were happening in different countries, and we selected a small number for each of the themes, which we then used in order to develop our reports. These were the ones we selected were representative of the kind of work that was happening across the consortium. And you know, this idea was inspiring, would allow other people to learn from that practice, and then we built on that, and it was a great process. And through that process, we were able to identify within each of our papers a small number of themes which were really key to these two areas, to policy and how you develop policy, and how you include wider groups of people who are perhaps marginalized at the moment, who don't have access to digital resources, who don't have the skills or haven't had the opportunities to train in those areas. We were able to look at policy in that respect, and we were also able to look at the kind of good practice from across the consortium that we could each learn from, and in our own contexts, and develop our own practice from. Yeah. So yeah, very good process. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter. What I find very interesting is this. I mean, we struggle as from small countries with small languages. Let's say, if it's not in English, it doesn't exist. So that's really a worthy way of including and kind of an inclusive practice. And also, I find that this constant connection of policy and practice is key to EPN, and something which I would say is a good example of how research could be done to be richer. Sandra, how was it for you as a researcher to work in this process?
Yeah, it was very interesting for me. Actually, I thought about it that for me it has proved to be quite an innovative and really valuable method. And it was actually the first time for me to use this method, because usually we as researchers, we work alone, we gather the data alone, but here this method really is based on such extensive collaboration between the experts. So I think it was valuable experience and interesting for me as well.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay, so this is about research and how it was done and the experience of a researcher. I think it's also something to think about. You said researchers often work alone with big sets of data. Sometimes we're always trying to get the original research done. And sometimes many things are repeated, maybe not so necessarily. And this is not on the international level only, but I guess on national level as well. We have lots of data for things that we don't really then use further. So I think this is definitely collaboration as a part of research, as an idea, is really worthy. Okay, so let's dive a little bit into the findings of your research. Peter, for you. So benefits of digital technology used in pedagogy and assessment. As a network, we're especially interested in inclusion, so I would like to see if you could point us in that direction a little bit. And how do these technologies actually then transform pedagogy?
Yeah, I mean, there are some areas where digital technologies have really made a huge difference. And I mean, I think we need to say at the outset, there's also some areas where the potential of digital technologies hasn't yet been realised, you know. But one of the areas where it has already made a difference is in the inclusion of people with some sometimes we have the inclusion of people with disabilities. Sometimes we have the inclusion of people who are in some form of social marginalisation. Sometimes we're talking about people who are perhaps have learning difficulties and learning disabilities. So there's a whole range of inclusive possibilities within the use of digital technologies, some of which are really, really well developed. In particular, for example, inclusion technologies for people with hearing impairment, where you get, for example, different forms of enhancements whereby whatever the impairment is, so it's a hearing impairment, you could have an enhancement with a visual impairment, you could have people who perhaps have mobility issues or mobility concerns or mobility difficulties. The technology allows that to be addressed. So perhaps text readers where a visual representation on a screen is read aloud, that anything that's on a screen is converted into an auditory output so that you can listen to what's on the screen. Visual enhancements where the visual text on a screen in some way is the color is changed, for example, the text is changed, the font is changed, things are clarified so that people can see them more clearly. These are the basic ways in which a straightforward program can really change somebody's life by making things accessible to them. The way in which keyboards can be adapted so that if you have dexterity problems, if you can't use a very finely graded keyboard, then there are other means by which you can type into a device, by which you can communicate. If you can't express yourself using language, using oral language, then you can express yourself through typing using some sort of medium that is an interface between you. So these are all really, really strong ways, and there's lots and lots of technology about that. And I think what we find is that increasingly these techniques are also being used for learning difficulties as well. So there are programs that will enhance the learning of vocabulary and spelling to students who have dyslexia, which will enhance their understanding of mathematics if they have a form of dyscalculia, or if their learning of mathematics is very they find it very difficult. So increasingly, these forms of inclusion are extending into the area of learning and learning difficulties as well. But then there's also, just finally, there's a range of ways in which software itself can enhance people's lives. If they, for example, if they find social relationships difficult, so if they find expressing themselves in a group difficult, then the opportunity, for example, to communicate through text, the opportunity to communicate online in this kind of environment, the opportunity to have not an immediate discussion like we're having now, but an asynchronous discussion where you type and then you wait for a response, and then you can think about your response before you post it. These are all ways of supporting learners, which otherwise, in a group, face-to-face, having to respond immediately, those learners may not be able to participate. And so it can bring out an opportunity there for a social inclusion for people who otherwise feel that social situations are very difficult for them. So yeah, there's a massive range, and it's actually opened my eyes to just what a wide range of possibilities and practices there are available just by engaging in this research. Almost every area of inclusion has alongside it the possibility of integrating and bringing in and using technologies to support that.
Yeah, I guess this online that we were forced to go into also opened up some possibilities that it offers. I find often that we feel always that people who are extroverted, and this happens in classrooms a lot, that extroverted students are seen as the good students, where it might be just that they are, open and can easily talk, and maybe this online actually surroundings are helping them to express themselves better and to show also their knowledge. But yes, very interesting part with what technology can do. Maybe just an let's say a sub question to this one. Did you find a lot of practices? I mean, is it really widely used in schools? Is there anything there that you could find that teachers are really using this technology that's available to them?
Again, I mean, this depends very much on infrastructure, and I think that one of the concerns, I think, is that there are some countries where a huge amount of money has been spent on digital infrastructure, and there are other countries where either for one reason or another that hasn't happened. A whole range of reasons why that might not have happened. There may simply not be the infrastructure there to cope with that, or there might be other spending priorities which have taken priority over it. So it very much it depends on other things outside of the school, often, whether these technologies are available. The other thing, of course, is that, as I said, in some areas, so for example, if you have provision in a country where there is specialist provision for learners with, say, hearing impairments or visual impairments, then they are more likely to be providing it because they have been able to concentrate resources in a particular school or a particular institution. Whereas if those students are in mainstream school, then they're less likely to be supported in that way because it is an additional expense for a very small number of students. And I'm not here saying anything about whether it's right to concentrate or to distribute people depending on particular needs. But what I am saying is that tends to be the pattern. And it will vary from nation to nation, really, and from system organisation to system organisation. There'll be different ways of dealing with these things.
And whether the ministry or the policy is actually investing into this type of technology to support, and is it in schools? Yeah, many questions open, but yes, possibilities are immense, definitely. Sandra, to move a little bit to you. So collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership in the digital age. Is it only about use of digital tools? How do they contribute to collaboration then? What did you find?
Actually, it's not only about the digital tools. So digital age is so much more. I mean that these kind of traditional methods, such as, for instance, face-to-face group works or critical discussions, peer-to-peer learning, all these methods that we associate with collaborative learning, but also collaborative teaching and school leadership, these remain. They have not vanished and they have not lost their importance. But digital tools in digital age certainly can provide additional value. Peter already described it meticulously, but regarding the collaboration dimension, digital tools enable students to practice collaborative learning and school leaders and teachers, collaborative school leadership also in distance learning. If we have to communicate with each other in distance, for instance, students and school leadership who are in different schools, in different regional settings, or in the context of remote learning that we know so well because of the COVID-19 pandemic right now. So we can practice collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership in distance. It's on one hand, but on the other hand, digital tools really can enrich collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership as well by providing different ways of practicing collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership. For instance, if we use such platforms such as Kahoot, for instance, then we can introduce playful learning in collaborative learning. Or if we use several Google platforms or Miro, for instance, then the learners can easily share materials, study materials with each other. They can co-create knowledge and so on. So digital tools definitely can enrich collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership.
If I understand correctly, digital tools are helping, but it's not only about the tools itself. It's also about, I guess, ways of using the tools.
Yes.
Yes, there are in both of your papers, I find the examples from Praxis extremely interesting. Peter, you highlight several of them. I mean, of course, everybody probably would have a preference to the one they would hear about, but I thought the flipped classrooms was interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because it's been around now for, well, since about 2013, but I think probably it's something which developed before then and then was captured and written about in about 2013. I mean, with a traditional classroom, I guess the idea is you learn something in the classroom and then you go home and you practice that in some sort of activity or task that the teacher gives you as homework. Well, the flipped classroom just turns that the other way around, flips it the other way around, so that you are given some preparatory activities to do before you come to the classroom. Maybe if you're looking at a particular topic, whether it's whatever subject it's in, then you're given some research to do where you find out a little more about the topic, or it may be that you revise an earlier theme that you've considered if you're going to build on that theme in the work in the classroom. But in some sort of way, you're encouraged to do some preparatory work which leads to the activity. And that means that when the teacher then is working with you in the classroom, they can start really without having to remind everyone what happened, without having to check that everyone has a certain grounding of understanding. They can make the assumption that actually we in the classroom, my job as a teacher in the classroom is not to give you lots of information, but we can actually start in the classroom then with a discussion about what you already know about this subject, because I know you've already done some preparatory work about it. So, for example, if we were talking about a geography lesson and the teacher said that we want today to talk about climate change, which I'm sure is a really big concern in schools for right across Europe, then the students might be given a task of going home and finding out about current debates, what things are being said, why is it that certain countries are acting and other countries aren't, maybe in a secondary school, so we're talking maybe 16-year-old students here. And then when the teacher then begins the lesson in the class, we're not starting from a what is climate change or what evidence is there for it. We're starting from, well, what do you think about this? Let's have a discussion. What viewpoints would you like to share with everybody? What evidence is there for those viewpoints? Is there any evidence that supports this particular argument? And is there any evidence against it? And you can have a more thoughtful and considered and in-depth discussion than you might do if you're simply assuming that learning only happens in school. And I guess that's the big point, is that it's trying to make the barrier or the distance between what happens out of school and what happens in school much closer, so that learning isn't just something that we expect to happen in schools. So it's an interesting approach. I mean, it's not an approach which is without difficulties. I mean, it does assume that students outside of school have equal digital access. And that's the difficulty, because they don't. And it's not without its difficulties, but it's certainly been. I mean, it's been a very popular approach in some countries where the digital infrastructure is stronger and where there is a more equitable access to digital resources. Yeah.
I think here what is really interesting, it changes the role of a teacher from a provider of knowledge to a facilitator of learning. So I think this is something, and thinking, you know, just even from my experience in school, where boring, the lesson was boring, and then homework was even more boring. It seems that this way you could flip that and really have these deep discussions in classroom. But as you said, I'm sure there are many problems, not only access to digital at home, but it could also be about how teachers are prepared for this type of facilitation of a facilitator rather than provider of facts and knowledge. But definitely an interesting approach. Yes, there is more in the papers for those who are interested, so you could go. There are other practices that are also interesting that we don't have time to discuss today. Sandra, phenomenon-based pedagogy. Could you define this for us and how it links to this collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership? Maybe you can also provide us with an example.
Well, phenomenon-based pedagogy can be actually considered as one specific type of collaborative learning because what it means that this approach sees a student as a researcher. So student is not just passively learning, the knowledges are not transferred from a teacher to a student, but the student actively investigates one real-life phenomenon, her own or by himself. And this phenomenon can be whatever real-life phenomenon, for instance, European Union or the rise of artificial intelligence or such kind of phenomena. And so a student does it with other students who are also considered as researchers, so they are collaborating. And what is also very important is that they investigate this phenomenon from different angles, so from the perspectives of different subjects, and they are guided by different subject teachers. So actually it brings the collaboration between the students, between the teachers, also between the subjects. So it is a kind of like holistic approach to education. And yes, I found some examples. One very outstanding country that has used phenomenon-based pedagogy a lot is Finland, where it is actually compulsory for the basic school students since 2014. So there are lots of examples in Finland. One that I can recall and what was very interesting for me and inspiring was a phenomenon-based pedagogy project where students aimed at finding out what games did the seniors play when they were young. So they investigated these kind of old-fashioned games. They wanted to know what were the games, how these games were played. So they interviewed the local senior residents. They also asked them to teach them these games. And in order to bridge the generations, the young people taught today's games to seniors as well. So they taught seniors to teach today's games using digital tools. So very interesting, mutual playing. And this project ended with students creating a video where they played these old-fashioned games, and they also showed this video to the seniors. So this is one interesting example of these kind of projects.
Thank you, Sandra. Yes, and it somehow connects to what we talked about in flipped classrooms as well, because both of them have a student really at the center of their learning, in which they are the researchers, they are the ones who are really active in this process, which is something that is definitely important. Again, interestingly, you already said a little bit about playful learning. I guess with this project that you mentioned, it also connects these two approaches, both this phenomenon-based pedagogy, but also this playfulness, and actually brings, I guess, joy to learning, which is something that we would like to see in our students. They learn to enjoy learning rather for it to be something that is a task and out of their control. So in this way, they're very much at the center. We already kind of, Peter, touched this topic about digital gap. We are all aware of the digital gap that exists in Europe. But you have in the paper also highlighted some policies that try to mitigate this. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's one of the major things that's come out of the pandemic. Actually, really, many countries have switched to online learning because of the need to isolate and keep students away from schools. But of course, the access to online digital tools and digital media is varied, and some students, I mean, in across the countries we looked at, in every country there was a gap between those students who had ready, easy access to digital devices and to reliable networks, reliable connections, reliable digital frameworks, the whole range of things. There were students in that bracket, and then there were students who didn't have that. There were students who, for example, a student where him and his sister both were sharing their mother's mobile phone to access resources and access schools. So even if they were, the school was providing a huge amount, these students were unable to access that. And that was repeated time and time and time again. So it is a big concern. And certainly, you know, one of the reasons why the research that I looked at suggested that the benefits of digital technology use is, you know, hasn't been met, the actual potential hasn't been met, is because of these kind of practical concerns about inequality. I mean, there's other things as well which are very similar. So one of the things that is really significant is the number of countries. I mean, just 3 examples: Italy, Germany, and the UK as well, provided resources for students who didn't have access to digital devices. So through their schools, they were provided with digital devices. A number of countries provided free internet use, for example. So these immediate practical problems were specifically for the pandemic. But my concern as a researcher is, what about the longer term? What can we do about this in the longer term? And there's a number of things. I mean, we certainly can invest in schools to upgrade their provision, their IT provision. But we need to do something else, and that is we need to work with teachers so that teachers are comfortable. There's potentially a generational divide, where some teachers are more confident. Now, that's not always, but it does tend to be younger teachers. But there are younger teachers who also are not confident in using IT and using digital tech tools as well. And there are some teachers who are very experienced, who are very confident as well. So we can't generalize on these things, but there is definitely a need to support our colleagues, to support school leaders as well. We also need to look at the availability of platforms, so learning platforms, whether the students have access to some sort of online environment, whether that environment is relatively easily accessible from a kind of less data heavy connection, so that you can get away with it if you haven't got a very strong connection. I mean, in countries like Croatia, for example, where you have island communities, you know, it's about the kind of interconnections that are available. It's the same in Scotland. It's the same anywhere where you have a wide population spread across a relatively small area. How can we enhance that connectivity given potential infrastructural difficulties? And so these are things really which only governments can address. And I think these are the kind of priorities that we will be pushing for. And alongside that, there's also issues of digital access for individuals. So we know, for example, that some forms of access, say through tablets or bigger mobile devices, is needed for some resources. You can't do it through your phone. So for those students who can't afford those resources, we should be looking at whether schools can loan them those resources, even give them those resources if they're going to be increasingly dependent on them. And so there's a range of things that we can have. I mean, there are some very interesting projects in this light from across Europe, which began before the pandemic. I mean, in Croatia, I just mentioned Croatia simply because there's a very extensive project in Croatia, the eSchools project, which has had some fascinating results. Now, some of the results are still, I mean, the pandemic came at the wrong time in a sense, because some of the results are still forming, and we can't say for certain. But the combination of providing materials, providing training for teachers, and creating a supportive environment in schools, these three things together, that's what's needed. You can't just give people devices and then say, get on with it. You have to provide that support as well. And where it's really worked is where there's been a whole range of support, of devices, and of professional training for teachers and school leaders. And the parents and the community have been involved as well. When you get all these things together, that's when it really seems to work.
Yeah, it seems always that when policy attacks one of these things, it starts with one thing, it doesn't take the holistic approach. That is one of the problems, I guess, in policy across Europe, but in some countries more so than in others. We've had several attempts with this, giving the device to students. I mean, it was across eastern part of Europe, Southeast Europe, with Roma students. That was one of the, I think, even one of the big companies actually had this whole thing of we'll give each child a laptop and all problems will be solved. But it doesn't work like that. So it's always the problem if there is no support behind it. These big costly projects can fail, and then it somehow the blame comes not on the students are the ones who suffer in this.
Yeah, for sure.
It is then said it's not this is not a good thing for this group. We shouldn't give them computers. But yes, yeah, a holistic approach to these things are really, really important. As like with everything in education, a holistic approach doesn't really move the things as much forward as we would like. Sandra, what about in your research? Did you find any evidence or examples how collaborative learning and collaborative school leadership supports inclusion? Did you find any examples of that?
Yes, I did actually. I can recall two examples, two projects. So one project was called Included, actually. A huge project that was implemented in many countries and which aimed to include really school staff, students, also the parents of students, no matter their socioeconomic status. So everybody to the steering processes of school. So in collaboration, they try to articulate what are the main challenges of the school, what are the main problems, and what is the vision of these people regarding in what direction the school should go. So everybody were included, everybody who wanted to be included, so finally concrete steps were also agreed on. So I guess this is one good example of inclusion in collaboration. And another project that I can recall is called Edu. It's a project that is implemented in Hungary. This is focused on students who cannot attend school for a longer period of time. So maybe they are ill because of the illness or some other problems, they can't attend. And so these children will be included actually by the students themselves. So secondary school students create personalized study materials for these children, and university students go to these children, instruct them, support them personally, and so in this way also children who are ill can be included in the study process, and it has proved to be quite effective one, successful, because children who cannot attend school, they have shown to really learn more effectively in this way, this personalized instruction way. And what this method also provides for these children is a valuable peer learning or peer-to-peer learning experience as well, because these children usually get help by the adults, but in this way they will have connections with other students.
Thank you, Sandra. You mentioned two very important things for inclusion, which I think are often disregarded. One is participation in the governance or in the thinking about how school can be. And yes, this seems to be a good example. And this other one where this peer learning that is not only about learning, but also about socialization, especially for children who are isolated, and this is about their well-being, but it's also about the well-being about those who provide this support. So it is really important parts of inclusion that can be supported in this way. Well, thank you both very much. I mean, there's of course much more in both of your papers than we can cover today. I would like to give you, if you would like to add something before we close, something that comes to mind as important and we haven't managed to mention it.
Yeah, I just to go back to something we said earlier on. In school systems where they tend to be dominated by teacher-led teaching, so traditional teaching, teachers find it very difficult to use new digital technologies effectively, because as we've both suggested, the most effective use of digital technologies is students are collaborating, interacting, and doing things actively. And so it's not just, digital technologies isn't just like a magic bullet that will suddenly improve classrooms. It's not like that at all. It tends to shape itself to the way that teachers are already teaching. And so yes, what we find in school systems where there's very traditional teaching, they tend to use digital technologies just to enhance their presentation. So they'll use PowerPoint, they'll use whiteboards, they'll use videos, they'll just present more information to students. And that's not always the most effective way of using it, you know. So there's still a long way to go with this, you know, and it's not just about looking at the tools, it's also looking at the practice in classrooms as well.
Absolutely, and this is one danger that we might be in this area, that all the reforms go into digitalization in the sense of buying the tools, or we've had that here at one point. Every school got this, what do they call them, smart boards, and these smart boards were in every classroom, but teachers didn't use them, or didn't even understand, didn't get the training on how to use them or how to enhance their practice by having this smart in their classrooms. So yes, practice in the end is still the most important, and the tools are there just to support good practice of teaching, I would say. Sandra, would you like to add something for the end?
Yes, one interesting thing that I thought about is, and that came out in my research, is the distinction between cooperative learning and collaborative learning. So when I did my research, I discovered that collaborative learning is practiced in many schools in many countries, but maybe it is that it's not always the collaborative learning, but it's instead cooperative learning. So there is the distinction. Collaborative learning is so much more than cooperative learning. And well, just to explain it a little bit, cooperative learning is just simply dividing the tasks between the students, whereas collaborative learning is students' continuous efforts towards mutual learning goal. So it's so much more. So it was interesting, this distinction for me, and maybe the educationalists might sometimes think about it, whether the practice they are practicing is the one or the other.
Thank you, Sandra. I guess it could be a lesson for all of us as well, whether we're cooperating on projects or collaborating on projects. I think EEPN is a good example of how we can collaborate on research rather than just cooperate, where in each country everybody does the same questionnaire and then we come together and we compare it. So in that sense, thank you very much for this collaboration today. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Peter. It was a real pleasure. For everybody who wants to find out more, at the end of this recording, you will find the website of both EEPN and NEPT for further investigation. Thank you so much, both, and goodbye.